Day 248 to 11:02 a.m. Kawasan Falls, Municipality of Badian, Province of Cebu. The mini cube approached the location from the sky. Seeing the giant cluster of trees that had been shaped into a living mansion, the members of Mark's group who had seen it the first time were pretty amazed. As for Mark, he could only wonder. The last time that Mark saw that cluster of trees, he was with Pafile and Edsel to rescue Celine. They had to enter the secret realm of Tamawos through a secret passage. At that time, the tree was not visible outside. However, Mark and the rest could see the cluster of trees from afar even though was no way they were within the supposed vicinity of the realm where the Tamawos lived. It only meant one thing. The subspace where the home of the Tamawos was located was broken. It caused everything inside that realm to be integrated into the real world, which was what they were currently seeing. Mark stretched out his right hand, calling the photokinesis mental crystal out of the psycrystal embedded on his wrist. As the marble-sized crystal glowed, the giant silhouette of the mini cube became invisible to everyone outside. The sight of a flying vessel would surely cause trouble, especially when the witnesses were humans. While it was unlikely that the members of Mark's group would be defeated in direct combat, it was questionable about stealth attacks. Mark could also detect any living creature inside his detection range. However, abilities that could affect them silently, like Bella and Donna's, did exist. It was better to cause less reason for conflict and not let down their guards. Besides, it was better to investigate the situation from the sky without getting seen by anyone below. With the optical camouflage surrounding the floating vessel, the mini cube flew towards the cluster of gigantic trees. They closed in enough that they could see the ground below. However, the mini cube did not try to fly too close to the ground. The Tamawo was still a magical race. The magical fluctuations of the floating vessel might alert them if it got too close. But, unfortunately, or maybe, fortunately, it seemed that their concerns were unnecessary. Mark told Chimetris to keep the mini cube afloat above the village. He then went out and jumped off to the ground below. And what Mark saw was a scene long after chaos ended. The huts where the tribesmen lived were all in shambles. The other structures and the parts of the walls of the village were broken and in tatters. Most of all, no one, at least alive, lingered anywhere nearby. The village where the Tamawos lived just a bit more than a month ago was utterly abandoned. One would initially think that the village was destroyed due to the earthquake caused by the fusion of dimensions. The most prominent signs around the village pointed to that possibility, such as destroyed surroundings and structures. However, it might not be the case. Mark approached a nearby collapsed hut. The hut was already covered in vines and grass. For some reason, Mark found a trace of a strong, lingering sentiment from there. And he was not mistaken. Mark approached the thick cluster of vines and cautiously cut it to pieces with the whip blade, the divider he took out from his ring. Underneath the cluster of vines was a pile of bones. Furthermore, it was just a pile of bones belonging to someone's torso with its whole right arm seemingly missing. Mark left the pile of bones and began searching the whole area further. It took him around 15 minutes, making the others above wonder what was taking him too long. Finally, they saw Mark take flight, and he entered the mini cube. "Let's go. There's nothing to see here," Mark said as he entered. By his tone, he seemed a bit disappointed. "What happened?" Spera asked the question everyone wanted to ask Mark. "Is it already abandoned?" "More than abandoned," Mark replied as he sat down at the corner of the bridge. "It got destroyed." "Really?" Ilya asked in surprise. "Yeah," Mark nodded. "It looks like the people there did not leave peacefully. They were attacked by something. It must have happened right after the fusion. Most of the traces of the battle either got covered by grass or were almost gone already. The blood stains left behind were also washed out a bit." "Something. Not the infected?" Spera asked, noticing Mark's unsure words. "I think it's not the infected. More like feral evolved animals," Mark explained. There are claw marks on the destroyed parts of the walls and sharp teeth marks on the bones scattered around the place. The marks also varied in size, which is likely because they were attacked by multiple enemies. But it could also be the infected, right? Ilya thought of the possibility. I mean, after fighting the infected for almost a week, their kinds and mutations really varied. Besides, even animals can become one of those abominations. I know, Mark shrugged and then pointed at the window with a shrug. But look at the terrain first before saying that. Ilya did as Mark told. It was the same for Spera and the others. Ah, Ilya came to a realization. The village of the Tomawos was built in a strategic location. The south and east sides faced a tall cliff, while the remaining directions were surrounded by steep mountainous terrain. This kind of terrain was not something the infected would be able to traverse in large groups. The only creatures that would be able to traverse this type of terrain in large numbers would be, as Mark said, evolved animals. While it was true that an intelligent infected might be able to traverse the terrain around the village, it would still go against Mark's findings that the Tomawos were attacked by multiple enemies. Intelligent infected were still rare to come by, and even if they were smart enough to lead hordes, they still would not be able to overcome the common horde's weakness. Being brainlessly dumb. As for infected animals, the same logic applied. Yes, infected animals were more agile and nimble than most common infected. However, even the infected animals would have a hard time traversing terrain that needed careful thinking. This was one reason there were fewer infected in the mountains, including infected animals. On the other hand, evolved animals were getting smarter than before. Although it was still not at the level of trained animals, it would be easy for them to climb up and down hard terrain. Even feral. Without a doubt, it was more likely that the village of the Tomawos was attacked by feral evolved animals than the infected. And as Mark commanded, they left towards their main destination after this short stop. Mark found what he was looking for. The end of the antagonists of Paphile's story. However, he somehow felt a tinge of discontent. It was as if he wished he was there to watch their downfall. Gerger, are you okay? May asked as she sat down with Mark. Mark glanced at May and then leaned his head on her shoulder. I'm kinda bored, I guess. Mark replied. It was not wrong to say Mark was bored. He was cooped up in Margaha Valley for 6 days to recover his strength. Mark had a bit of anticipation to see how the Tomawos ended up. And while he did find the answer, it was rather lackluster. Why don't you lay down for a bit and relax? May suggested as she presented her lap. Mark gave May another glance and followed her suggestion. Then, there was silence. Everyone on the bridge of the mini-cube, without a single word, had a tacit understanding to keep silent and avoid that corner. Mark felt relaxed under May's care. If he could sleep at this time, he would. However, while traveling, they would come across enemies here and there. In their case, the flying infected. As such, Mark and May would need to deal with those nuisances. However, it seemed that Mark's thoughts were unnecessary. As they flew further away from Mount Canlaon and Tanyon Strait, the encounters became lesser and fewer in the number of enemies. They also decided to take a path that would make them travel further from the strait to avoid more troubles along the way. Mark and May did not have to interfere anymore. Since maneuvering the mini-cube was unnecessary when facing an enemy or two, Chemetrice just went out by himself to deal with the troubles, leaving the piloting of the mini-cube to Ilya. After leaving the destroyed village of Tomawos, the journey was a bit peaceful compared to earlier. If they had known that it would be like this from the start, they might have avoided passing directly above Tanyon Strait or, at least, away from the area the battle occurred a week ago. With a more peaceful ride, Mark could relax. The others were the same since having enemies while traveling in the sky would surely make people that could not fly a bit on edge. However, barely uneventful changed after they reached the mountain ranges in the municipality of Sabonga. As they were passing through the sky west of the mountains, Spera noticed something. Hey, is that smoke? Spera said, looking at the smaller window on the right side of the bridge. Normally, such words would not warrant such attention. But in the current state of the world, smoke could either mean survivors or enemies. Mark immediately surrounded the mini-cube with optical camouflage, while telling Chemetrice and Ilya to move east towards the mountains. As Spera said, there was smoke rising towards the sky. It was not the kind of thick smoke that one would witness during forest fires. Instead, it was the kind of smoke that would dissipate soon after reaching a certain height. A smoke that one would see if there was a person cooking using firewood. If the mini-cube was flying any lower, Spera would not be able to spot the smoke at all. However, as they were flying high and the mountain near them was a bit low, she managed to get a good look at it. The mini-cube carefully approached the source of the smoke. They found it coming from a hilly valley in the middle of the mountains. And there, they found a small settlement. Mark checked the place using the offline map on his phone. This place seemed to be a valley between Mount Lonan and Mount Kalotkat, an area with wide plantations and small settlements. However, the settlement they were currently seeing was definitely newly built. It was all made of huts using leaves from coconut trees that were plenty in the area. On the map, however, a similar settlement was located in the same area as the new settlement was built. It was not surprising. The old settlement would not be able to withstand the earthquake more than a month ago. But for a new settlement to be built in the same place, did people from the previous settlement manage to survive? That was what they had thought until they reached the distance where the village entered Mark's detection range. Mark was genuinely surprised. There were familiar fluctuations coming from the people in the settlement. Mark told Chemetrice and Ilya to land the mini-cube nearby. There was no way Mark would pass this event. More than a month ago, Mark did give a group of people a piece of subtle advice. That group followed that advice and managed to survive the catastrophe Sinogo soon brought in Matutaneo. They also followed the other advice Mark told them. Nonetheless, the advice Mark gave had no guarantee of allowing them to survive the incoming catastrophe. That was why Mark was pleasantly surprised. The people they met before fighting the Tomawos, although reduced by a number, mostly managed to survive. Furthermore, it seemed their group had actually grown in number. Day 248 to 1159 Barangay Sao, Municipality of Sabonga, Province of Cebu. The mini-cube landed behind a hill in the southwestern area of the valley. It was a small clear land surrounded by a thick forest. After observing the surroundings a little, it was clear that the residents of the settlement would not come here often, making the place suitable for hiding the mini-cube, without needing to cover it with optical camouflage. Of course, it also meant that his place was dangerous. For normal people, at least. As if giving them proof of how dangerous this area was, Mark was immediately attacked by something the moment he stepped out of the mini-cube. Mark felt something, and he took a step back. It was when he saw some kind of string now extended from the ground in front of him. It led towards one of the trees to his right. In retaliation, Mark pointed in the direction of the tree and shot a small ball of lightning. With a soft crackle and a loud thud, something pretty large fell from the tree to the ground. Mark approached the culprit without hesitation. In fact, he already detected the enemy before he alighted the mini-cube. It was also one of the reasons he took the lead out of the door. Right at the exposed root of the tree, Mark shot. He stared at the wriggling phosphorus-colored caterpillar. It was about 6 inches tall and 3 feet long. The caterpillar's length was definitely longer than Miracle's height and almost reached Abigail's at 8 years old. Mark controlled his blood and made a constricting leash. He then measured the strength of the still extended string and cut it to tie the caterpillar so it would not escape. Gurgur. What is that? May stepped back as Mark returned with the constricted caterpillar. It was not only May. Even Bella and Donna felt goosebumps seeing the thing. Mark could only shrug. These women already faced all kinds of abominations. Yet, a single caterpillar could make them step back and make disgusted or frowned faces. Well, the caterpillar Mark had was about 3 feet long. Its disgustingly squishy segmented body, wrinkled head, and hairy underside all became emphasized by the caterpillar's gigantic size. Still, May could fight spiders without problems, even horrendously gigantic ones. It seemed that it was just caterpillars having this unique trait that would make many people feel instinctually disgusted. Surprisingly, Sparrow was fine. As for the little girls and Amihan, they were more interested than afraid. On the other hand, Elia, a demon, was more confused about why Mark brought that thing back. And to May's question, Mark answered with a shrug. Silkworm. That was right. What attacked Mark seemed to be an evolved silkworm with its diet changed to meat instead of leaves. It was not infected, nor feral. When Mark detected it, it seemed to be looking for prey to hunt. It just happened that Mark's group landed in front of it, and the silkworm spotted Mark coming out of the door. For an evolved insect, the intelligence of this silkworm did not seem to be high enough. If it developed some intelligence, it would flee after seeing Mark instead of attacking. What do you plan on doing, carrying that over here? Sparrow finally asked. It was a reasonable question. Mark could have just killed it just now, but it looked like he only paralyzed it. And to answer the next question, Mark only made Sparrow see the thick string the silkworm shot at him. It was like a web, but soft while also being sturdy. Normally, it was cocoons of silkworms that were used to weave silk. In this case, however, this web-like silk was more than enough to be woven into fabric. Furthermore, a cocoon would be a limited resource, unlike the silk web that the silkworm could secrete. Mark's mind sure was quick in analyzing possible materials. The silkworm only saw him as prey once, and Mark immediately turned it into a resource. I wonder if there are others, Mark murmured, making the three women freeze. There's a lot of creatures in the forest, but I can't detect any similar mental fluctuation nearby. Those words from Mark made May and the sisters feel a bit relieved, although the sisters could not understand what Mark meant by mental fluctuations. Still, one caterpillar was enough. They did not know if they would be able to handle seeing more. Ha! Sparrow sighed. Just why did we land here? Aren't we going to that village we saw earlier? Or are we going worm hunting? It's a caterpillar. Mark said to Sparrow. It's called a silkworm, all right. Sparrow argued. No, it's not. Mark smirked. Are we going or not? Sparrow slapped her forehead, knowing that Mark was trying to tease her again. Mark shrugged as he told everyone they were leaving. Of course, it was not literally everyone. Like the usual, Elia and Shemetrice would be left to guard the mini cube. Since the two were staying behind, Mark left the caught silkworm in their care. Not like it would be able to escape with the restraints Mark put on it. Leaving the mini cube, Mark and the rest trekked through the hilly forest. As Mark said, there were quite a number of creatures in the forest. No wonder this area did not seem to be frequented by the residents of the settlement. If people passed through this forest, they would definitely be ambushed by the lurking animals and insects. Mark's group did not face any attack, however. He made sure that they would not be attacked. Since the forest inhabitants seemed to be evolved creatures, and not the infected, Mark could use his emotion induction to scare anything alive nearby. After a 10-minute uneventful walk towards the east, the group reached the other side of the hill and exited the forest. At the foot of the large forest-covered hill, there were actually remains of the ruined concrete road that passed through this valley. It must be what the survivors followed to get here since the road was still visible despite turning into rubble. Let's follow the road, Mark said as he led the group. Ah, right. And Mark suddenly paused. All of a sudden, Mark took several weapons he made using materials that May and the others brought back this past week. Wrapped spears, sheathed knives, and crossbows. Mark then distributed the weapons to the group. Spears for Bella and Donna, knives for the little girls, crossbows for May and Sparrow, and Mark hung a sword made of bones on his back. Mark then told May to store the usual weapons they use. What are the weapons for? Amihan asked as she watched him distribute the makeshift weapons. Well, we can't just roam around without weapons, Mark answered. Although we don't really need it, For the most part, it will look unnatural to other people. Also, the weapons we use are too eye-catching for people. May and the sisters agreed with Mark's words. Bella and Donna had already seen the weapons Mark's group usually use. And without a doubt, the white sniper sword of May and the black weapon set of Mark would easily draw unwanted attention. After preparing, Mark and the rest followed the road towards the north. Going through the forest towards the east and following the road was actually a longer route towards the settlement. They could have just gone through the forest towards the northeast and exited near the gates of the settlement. Yet, they took a longer route as per Mark's suggestion. Actually, Mark had a plan that would allow them to enter the settlement faster. And it was WHO. A surprised shout was heard as Mark's group traversed the ruins of the road. It was then followed by noises and panic as the voices went to scramble to get their weapons drawn. On the other hand, May and the others were also surprised that they actually took out the weapons that Mark handed to them. There were people seemed to be resting beside the ruined road with baskets and water containers in tow. No wonder they had to scramble to get their weapons out. They were carrying other important things. They were startled to see unfamiliar people and were extremely cautious. After all, it could be a group of infected. Wah! No way. Among the startled people, however, a man stared at Mark, May, Amihan, and the three little girls in utter surprise. Sir Emilio, what's wrong? The other people with the man were surprised by the man's reaction. And in response to the question, the man ordered hastily, "Lower your weapons." The rest of the group was confused by the order. Nonetheless, they lowered their weapons, although they kept their guards up. Actually, some of the men found the group before them rather familiar. "You people are still alive," Emilio voiced out with a voice filled with disbelief. "Although we only met once, I didn't think that you want us dead." Mark replied nonchalantly, "No, I didn't mean it like that." Emilio waved his hand defensively. "It's just." Emilio did not finish his words. A lot of things happened since the last time he saw this group arrive and leave their outpost. Most of the things that happened were catastrophic, and death would not be surprising. Yet, this small group of people was still alive. Not to mention looking healthy and fit. Emilio could not help but scan the members of Mark's group. He realized that he did not recognize the two women standing behind the rest and the petite foreign woman standing beside Mark. Furthermore, the teenage couple and the girl with green hair that were with Mark before were nowhere to be seen. The first thing that came into Emilio's head was the worst outcome, although he did not dare voice it right now. Mark, on the other hand, stared back at Emilio. Officer Emilio Della Rosa, the leader of the survivors from the destroyed Lilone military settlement. The last time Mark saw this guy, he still had the aura of a strict soldier. Now, rather than a soldier, he was only a leader of people surviving the apocalypse. The strictness was already gone from his movements, and his aura had become free and refreshing. For him to have this change, a lot of things must have happened to him and the group he led. "Are you guys looking for a place to stay?" Emilio asked Mark, thinking of the long journey they could have gone through. "We have a village just a bit up north. You guys can rest there if you want." Mark glanced at May and the girls before turning back to Emilio. "If you'll allow us," Mark replied, "there will be no problem. Your group will always be welcome," Emilio said with a smile. The former officer clearly remembered that they were still alive because of Mark's vague but serious advice. Basically, they owe their lives to Mark. The group then went together towards the settlement. Emilio spoke to Mark along the way. While Mark mostly listened, he would reply from time to time. Apparently, Emilio and his group were resting after fetching water and edible plants and fruits from the forest. Apparently, the nearest water source they had was about half a mile away from the settlement. That was why they had to fetch water outside. They all soon reached the settlement. The people guarding the gates were surprised to see Emilio's group bring back some people. It was until some of the people recognized Mark and they could only stare in disbelief. While the commotion was happening due to their arrival, Mark was confronted by May and Spera. Gerger, you know that we will encounter them on the road, right? May asked. He definitely knew it, Spera grumbled. He just deliberately didn't tell us. Well, you girls can show a better surprised expression if you didn't know, right? Mark smirked. It was part of Mark's tiny schemes. Before they found a place to land, Mark already detected the group coming from the forest to the southeast of the settlement. Mark then deliberately led his group to a coincidental encounter with Emilio and his group. To make this work better, they should play the part of a group surprised to unexpectedly meet people along the way. And as Mark thought, Emilio would invite them to the settlement. After all, it was easier to enter invited than asking outside the gates for entry. Day 248 to 1:02 p.m. Village, Barangay Sao, Municipality of Sabanga, Province of Cebu. Led by Emilio's group of people that gathered water and edible plants, Mark's group arrived outside the settlement. Emilio and the people who lived here apparently called it a village rather than a settlement. There was not much difference between the two names, but the term settlement meant more general while calling it a village gave a homey feel. Most of all, calling it a village implied that they all decided to settle down in this place and stop traveling. It was to make a home and take a stand against dangers instead of running away forever. By the way, Emilio talked to Mark. The former officer seemed to have gotten rid of his nervousness. Back then, Mark's aura and show of contempt were enough to make Emilio nervous. It was different this time as he spoke with Mark properly. They approached the walls and the southern gate, all of which were made from stripped coconut logs, which were abundant in the area. This valley was filled with coconut plantations before the apocalypse, and it seemed that most of the coconut trees in the area survived the fusion of dimensions. The guards were surprised to see other people aside from Emilio and his group that left to gather supplies. As Mark had thought, it was easier to enter a settlement being invited than coming straight to the gates. When arriving at the gates of a settlement, it was no surprise to get stopped by the guards. It was the protocol in large military-managed settlements. They only had such rules for the safety of the people living inside. After the procedure was done and one was let in, that was it. Of course, unless the outsiders caused trouble inside. In small secluded settlements, however, the situation was different. They did not have as much fighting power as large settlements, putting them on edge all the time. As such, they would not take outsiders lightly. Most of the time, their entry had to be approved by the leaders of the settlement. And even with that, the people would be wary towards those outsiders. Mark still remembered the last time when his group entered the temporary outpost led by Emilio. After entering, they were told to wait in a small room near the gates. The eyes of the guards were glaring at them. And with the slightest unnatural event, the guards did not hesitate to point their guns at Mark's group. If Mark and his group did the same thing today, it would not be surprising if the same events happened. After all, there would be no guarantee that the guards would recognize Mark's group. And even if he used that reason the moment he talked to the guards, he would only be met with suspicion until it was confirmed by those that recognized him. Still, while Mark's thoughts were on point, the results might have been different from what he initially had in mind. They did enter the settlement easily because of Emilio, but the guards at the gate actually recognized Mark, May, and the three girls. These people were new additions to Emilio's group, but it was not the first time for them to see Mark and the girls. It was because they were among the survivors from Barangay Matutineo. The very same people that Tamawos captured and turned into slaves. There was no way they would easily forget the people they owed their lives to. And the moment Mark stepped into the gates, the guards along the gate approached the group, showering them with gratitude as the poor people they saved were never able to properly give back then. Mark was troubled. This situation was something he did not expect. More than a month had passed already. There were also more things that happened on Earth for these people to dampen this kind of enthusiasm. But it seemed that Mark underestimated the gratitude that these people felt. Back when they were saved, These poor people were still in a state of shock and trauma. Rather than being unable to thank Mark's group, it was more like they were even questioning whether it was true that they were saved or if they were only dreaming. When the realization finally sunk into their minds, their saviors were nowhere to be seen. Some of them even thought that their saviors died because of them. Their lives were saved when their hopes had already sunk to the depths of nothingness. They would bear this gratitude for the rest of their lives. Now that they finally have the chance to properly convey that gratitude, they would not hesitate to do so. And it seemed that their gratitude was far stronger than the usual aura Mark had that made people avoid him for the most part. Fortunately, these people were not tactless. The guards here were all males. They approached Mark, the only male in the group, the leader, and the person that walked in the lead. The victims of the Tamawos knew well how it felt for their women to be approached by strangers, especially during the apocalypse. Despite their good intentions, they instinctually avoided approaching the women in Mark's group. It seemed they mistook the group as Mark's harem, considering he was the only male currently present. It was a misunderstanding, but it worked rather well in May's situation. Now, Emilio approached Mark and the guards. Our guests just arrived. Let them rest. They must have had a rough journey. Ah, yes, sir. The guards understood the blunder they had made. They were troubling their saviors, who had just arrived from a long journey. After apologizing to Emilio and Mark's group, the guards returned to their posts, although it seemed that they would not shut up about the things they witnessed during the battle of Mark's group against the Tamawos. It also seemed that they remembered the other members of Mark's group at that time that were not present today and were wondering what happened. Emilio then told the members of his group to store the things they collected while he would bring their guests to the village center. The rumors then spread through the small settlement like wildfire. Many people watched from the side as Mark's group followed Emilio to the center of the settlement. The people were like they were welcoming celebrities. But with half the current population being Emilio's initial group and the other half being mostly the survivors of the Tamawos invasion, it was no wonder that Mark's group was welcomed warmly and reverently. It was like a hero's welcome. Even the contempt that Mark showed the soldiers in the past was completely forgotten. Mark, being at the center of this kind of attention, felt uncomfortably itchy. Just what the hell did you guys do in this place? Spera uncomfortably whispered at Mark and May. It was worse for Bella and Donna. They did not know anything about what was happening at all. Mark and May only looked at each other with troubled faces and did not reply. Now, Mark was kind of regretting stopping by this place. Furthermore, Mark stared at Emilio's back. This guy was purposely slowing down their pace towards their destination. After several minutes, they reached a cluster of huts that seemed larger than most of the structures in the settlement. Since these huts were in the center, it was very likely that these structures were used in meetings and as facilities for important matters. And as Mark detected, one of the huts was being used to tend to the injured as he felt several weakened people inside. Mark's group was brought to the largest hut. It was built circularly with wooden foundations, with the walls and roofs were made of coconut leaves stitched together with vines. There were no doors, but a large piece of old cloth was used to cover the door entrance. It really looked like some sort of meeting room, considering the number of chairs and the large table at the center. Please sit down, Emilio said, inviting everyone to take a seat around the table. Sorry, but we don't really have anywhere to accommodate guests, Emilio apologized. In the least, this hut had more chairs for you guys to sit down on. Then, Emilio turned to Mark. He felt the latter's stare earlier. Also, sorry for parading your group through the village, Emilio admitted. We're doing better than before, but the morale is still kind of low at the moment. I'm kind of troubled about how to increase our people's morale for a while now. And today, your group came at the right time. It was the reason Emilio slowed down the pace when they arrived. It was to let as many people in the settlement see Mark's group. The group that fought hundreds of enemies and saved the people of Barangay Matutineo from the Tamawos. Since Mark's group left immediately after the battle against the Tamawos, some presumed they died, especially since everyone witnessed that beam of light that tore cracks in the sky along with the tidal wave that swallowed the entire coast. As their deaths were a very possible outcome due to their immediate disappearance, many felt dejected while thinking their saviors died because of them. And now that Mark's group was safe and sound, it was a good opportunity to raise the morale of the people that Emilio led. At this time, the cloth by the door moved. It's actually true. A middle-aged woman's voice was heard by everyone as someone entered through the door. There were several people who entered, and all of them were familiar faces from Emilio's initial group of survivors from Lilone. The voice just now was from Dr. Janice Reyes. The very same doctor that looked at Mark's group before they managed to speak with Emilio for the first time. At that time, Dr. Janice was terrified of Mark for some reason. This time, it seemed that she was calmer. Probably because she already had seen Mark before and could not be surprised anymore. There was also Caudillo Alcozba, the former fisherman who now led the construction of this settlement. He did not have any interaction with Mark's group before, but he still came as one of the pillars of this place. The last one was Private Tanya Monteroso. She was the one who guarded Mark's group during their stay. Back then, she was just a soldier at the bottom of the grid. Now, it seemed that she shared the same authority as Caudillo. Why were they suddenly here? I called for them. Emilio said before Mark could ask anything. It looks like you are only welcoming us, Mark shrugged. But you have other intentions, right? The people here were not all the pillars of this place. Mark remembered that there was also that flirty former actor, and other soldiers. However, there were only 3 currently present. The other leading soldiers were not called. As for that actor, it seemed that he was resting in the infirmary of the settlement. Mark took a look at the 3 people Emilio called as they took a seat around the table. There was clearly one reason why Emilio called them. It was because these people were the ones he trusted the most compared to everyone following his lead. And once everyone gathered around the table, Emilio took a breath. He showed the strict attitude he had before, although he contained it mostly for appearances. Emilio then stared at Mark. Thanks to you, the people the Tamawos captured were freed. Now, they are all integrated with our group, and I treat them equally as my people. But that was not all. Without any basis and warning, you gave us that advice, which I followed with insight. And thanks to that, we mostly survived. Not only once, but twice. Emilio then turned serious. Considering the things which happened afterward, it was too good to be a coincidence. You also mentioned privilege before, which I did not have. Then, I won't be asking about how you predicted such things would happen. But please, answer this question. Who are you? Day 248 to 1:25 p.m. Barangay Sao, Municipality of Sabonga, Province of Cebu. Who are you? Emilio stared at Mark, asking that question. He was not only referring to Mark but his group as a whole. The 3 people sitting beside Emilio remembered the time after they encountered Mark and his group. Back then, everyone was rather displeased due to their sudden departure from Madrielos. There was no time to prepare, and everyone had to rush. The displeasure grew when one of the soldiers in the meeting slipped up, and everyone learned that the reason for their departure was the words of a mere outsider. Fortunately, despite the displeasure, no one decided to split up. It was all due to the trust Emilio built up towards the members of their community. And so far, his instincts and actions never let them down. The displeasure was quenched when the battle Matutineo began. Although there was no way they would see the events clearly, the fight was too eye-catching, even from afar, especially the explosions that bloomed towards the sky and the burning flames they left. Such scenes could even be witnessed even in the darkness of the night. And then, the tidal wave came when everyone least expected it. There was no need for light. The shadow cast by the tall wave from the horizon could be seen from the hills they passed. It was not only Matutineo that was swallowed by the tidal wave. All areas around it, including Madrielos, were affected. They were scared by the thought of what could have happened if they did not leave the school today. They already survived one of these attacks once, and it already left a deep trauma on most of them. To see it happen again before their eyes horrified them greatly. The displeasure became gratitude. The people were thankful they were warned by the outsiders and that they followed Emilio's decision. Furthermore, at that time, the survivors from the invasion of the Tamawos were brought to their group. It was a good thing since these poor people were finally freed from the grasp of the vile creatures. However, it also made them worried about food and water since they would have more mouths to feed. But to everyone's surprise, the survivors from Matuaneo carried boxes of supplies taken from the Tamawos. Not only would it help feed the newcomers, but the amount would last more than a month for everyone if used sparingly. It meant that most of the supplies Mark's group recovered from the enemies were given to the survivors of Matutaneo. Then, Emilio and the others saw the beam of light that tore cracks in the sky. It shook their minds. What kind of being could do such a thing? And as soon that crack was created, it soon vanished for reasons they did not know. At the end of these events, they never saw Mark's group. It gave them the idea that they could have possibly died there. If they did not, maybe they left already, not intending to have any more interaction with Emilio and his people. That night, everyone's minds were deeply shaken by the events. The things they witnessed continued to baffle their minds as they continued their journey for the next day. As Mark advised them, they needed to find a flat area. No one could understand what he meant at that time. Nonetheless, they followed it. There was no need to mention that his advice saved them once already. Emilio led his group and climbed the hills of Badian the next day. Their pace was not fast at all, considering the state of the survivors from Matutaneo. The men were emaciated, while most women were in an unstable state of mind. It was not a surprising outcome. After all, the men were treated as slaves, while the women were taken away and treated as playthings. After the charm magic cast on the women wore off, all that was left was depression and suffering. The only good thing, well, definitely bad in a way, was that there were no elderly among the survivors from Matutaneo. The Tamawos had no use for the old. Anyone old enough in Matutaneo was killed immediately right after the Tamawos invaded the town. Late during the same day, Emilio's group found a suitable place. It was private farmland in the middle of nowhere. The place was not exactly flat as it was in the middle of a mountainous area. However, the slope was not steep, and even vehicles would have no problems driving uphill. There were also houses and buildings, although not that many. As for the farm's inhabitants, all they had left was the stains of blood around their homes. Emilio told everyone to prepare the houses and tents in a tight cluster. The last thing they wanted was to have no defense against possible attacks from either the infected or evolved animals. And as Mark advised them, they decided to stay at that place for a few days. Of course, the reason was unknown. Until a sound of an explosion from the sky roared as if warning everyone of the incoming catastrophe. Everyone watched as hundreds of meteorites began raining from the sky in horror. At first, they stared blankly in shock, wondering if it was all just a dream. But next came panic. It was when they cursed. They were in a flat land, mostly devoid of anything. There was no place to take cover, and the tents and houses would definitely not hold against those things falling from the sky. Many people wanted to run, but there was nowhere to run. It caused them to question whether following that cursed advice was the right thing. And then, one of those things from space was hurled toward them, causing people to panic even more. It was until that thing they saw the piece of the meteorite get destroyed as if hitting something invisible. It happened not only once but repeatedly as the things from space continued to rain. Some of those things crashed into nearby areas, making the people fall to the ground due to the shockwaves. However, they all realized that none of the debris hit them directly despite many supposedly falling towards them. They finally realized they were being protected by something they could not see. It caused them to question whether it had something to do with Mark, who told them to find a place like this. The catastrophe from the sky soon ended. Everyone miraculously survived despite some injuries. That was when the ground began to shake. Everyone was thrown to the ground once more. It was an earthquake with a strength no one had seen before. Before their shaking eyes, they saw the land in their surroundings shift. Many trees and structures fell, and many steep hills crumbled. And them who were in a clear and flatter area did not have to worry about things falling onto them. A weaker earthquake that lasted a few seconds already felt several hours. An unprecedentedly strong earthquake lasting several minutes felt like an eternity. But when everything stopped, they were all still alive. Their surroundings all changed except for a circular stretch of land around them. Everyone rejoiced they survived not just one but two catastrophes. 3 if the one the previous day was counted. And then, they all realized their survival was all because of one advice they heavily questioned. After that, they noticed the barrier and how dangerous it was outside through trial and error. It cost some lives since some of them tried to investigate the surroundings after the catastrophe but did not make it far and showed signs of radiation poisoning. Those people did not make it due to heavy radiation poisoning. They were the first casualties after the catastrophe. Realizing that they were trapped in a safety net, they did not know whether to laugh or cry. But as they were alive, they decided to make the best of what they had and try to hold it out. They encountered some of those robotic things, although looking mangled. These robots tried to attack them but were unable to pass through the invisible barrier. They took advantage of such an attack from inside and managed to destroy the dangerous attackers with great difficulty. The robots were hard, but since their metal bodies were already broken from the start, it was easier to disable them through the destroyed parts. Less than 1 month later, they all saw the barrier collapse. It meant that their protection was over, and they also realized that it was now fine to go out. But they could not stay here any longer. The area sure was flat and easily defensible. However, there was barely any resource they could gather, especially water. The place had a deep well pump, but it was destroyed during the earthquake. Thus, despite the danger, they all continued north. The journey was tedious. They encountered more enemies along the way, and the casualties increased. Since the roads were gone, they had no choice but to cut through unfamiliar forests that appeared after the world had changed. The casualties increased through the journey until they were tired of it. Finally, they found this place and decided to settle down. They were all tired of running away and tired of continuing further. This place had everything they needed to live, from clean water to edible fruits and plants. And there, this village was established. They finally found a place to call home. But at the end of it all, their chance for survival stemmed from one thing, one person. Mark. And now, the person was sitting in front of them. The question in their minds was given by Emilio. Who was Mark? And the rest of his group? Who were they? Janice, Caudillo, and Tanya stared at the people in front of them in silence. They were waiting for Mark's answer. But if the latter would not answer, there was really nothing they could do. Still, they want to know. They want to know who the person they owe their lives to really was. And finally, Mark opened his mouth. Normally, the script goes like I don't care who they are, they have our gratitude or something. Mark looked at Emilio and the other 3. But I guess it's different here, huh? Emilio and the other 3 could only show a bitter expression. Television dramas were one of the most prominent hobbies in rural areas, so everyone here understood what Mark meant. They did feel ashamed, but retracting the question was the least of their intention. Mark then shrugged. I'm just like you guys, surviving this new world. It's just that I became blessed with luck when everyone faced their downfall. Emilio and the other 3 were confused by Mark's answer. Not only them, however. Bella and Donna, who were curious, were also baffled by it. What do you mean? Emilio asked. Literally what I just said. Mark stared at Emilio. This apocalypse caused my life to become way better as opposed to most people's becoming miserable. And like most people in their ideal job, I'm just thriving while in the most suitable environment. The apocalypse. The answer was a bit confusing, but Mark did not say any lie. The apocalypse changed his life, and it shaped the current him. Will that answer suffice? Mark asked. Well, if you're asking whether I'm human or not, I'm not. I stopped being one. That statement surprised Emilio and the other three beside him. A demon, Emilio murmured before staring back at Mark. Are you connected to Ouroboros or the CNC? This time, it was the turn of Mark's group to be surprised, with the exception of the sisters, who knew nothing about the two organizations. Are you sure you can reveal that with everyone here? Mark asked, confirming his possible connections with the two organizations. That doesn't matter. There is no point in keeping it a secret anymore, Emilio replied. So, are you connected with the two? The answer will confirm whether we will treat you as an ally or an enemy. Emilio's expression was serious, and he told Mark in a frank manner even if there was no chance of them winning if a fight was to break out. I'm connected, but not as a member, Mark truthfully answered. I'm a customer of CNC, and the Ouroboros is my enemy. Emilio then sighed in relief. I knew it, Emilio smiled. There is no way a member of CNC will help us without payment, and it's impossible for a member of Ouroboros to help humans. Then why did you ask? Mark asked with a frown. I just have to confirm because there is still a chance, right? Emilio replied. It was true, although it was questionable if Emilio would be able to tell if Mark lied. The conversation gave Emilio some clarity on the situation and what Mark and his group possibly were. However, the rest of the people inside with them became more confused instead. Day 248 to 1:30 p.m. Village, Barangay Sao, Municipality of Sabanga, Province of Cebu. For you to deduce what I am and to know all these things, you're not just some regular soldier, are you? Mark asked Emilio as the root of their conversation was drifting away from what regular people would have. Mark only said that he stopped being human. And yet, Emilio immediately pointed out what he was. Not to mention that the organizations of Ouroboros and Crystallis Noticia Cetus were not things that a regular person should know even as a soldier. As proof, Dr. Janice and Tanya, who had workings with the military, were oblivious to this information. This information was not open to the public, and unless one had a high enough position or someone necessary to the nation, there was no way to know this information. And Emilio definitely did not have such a position to know these things. I had my own circumstances, Emilio replied hesitantly. Even though it would not matter now, I'm not inclined to divulge it to anyone. Emilio answered while staring at Mark, eye to eye. His circumstances were a personal matter that, even now, he would not want to tell anyone else, even the people he knew he could trust. This truth could change how people view him as a person, after all. Well, I won't dig any further. Mark said with a shrug. Sorry if my answer didn't fulfill your interest, but I want to ask something about another thing, Emilio continued to stare at Mark. 1 week ago, something happened on the western coast. Many of us saw the anomalous weather, not to mention that it caused the infected to migrate west. I want to ask if you're involved. Mark did not say anything and only replied with another shrug. However, that silence already gave the answer, making Emilio nod in understanding. Then, how long are you going to stay here this time? Emilio asked Mark, knowing that like before, Mark's group would not stay here permanently. We're not going to stay, Mark said with a slight tilt of his head. The people are currently too enthusiastic to our liking. So, we would rather be on our way. Besides, we only stopped by to check on this place, seeing that there are people here still alive. In short, Mark's group was just passing by. Emilio and the three people with him understood that much. I want to ask something. Dr. Janice interjected into the conversation. Go on. Mark gave the doctor a go. Since you gave us that advice, did you already know that all of this would happen? Dr. Janice asked her concern. If you want to ask as why I haven't told you guys about it straightly. It's because I don't really know what exactly is going to happen, Mark answered. The advice I gave would just increase the probability of you guys surviving compared to following your original plans. So if you ask me, it's all just a coincidence, everything aligned for the best outcome. You guys just got lucky. The people in this settlement were giving praises and gratitude to Mark. However, it was all a coincidence on his part. The advice he gave was only based on what he originally thought. It just happened to align with what happened afterward, which saved the people of this place for the most part. In fact, Mark's advice only accounted for the fusion of dimensions and possible effects during its duration. He had never predicted anything about the tidal wave or the mishap when the eyes and the foreign gods tried to block the planetary debris. Even if we're inhumanly strong, we have no way of exactly predicting the future. Mark said. Voluntary, that is. Mark had in his mind. I see. Dr. Janice said with a bitter nod. It might just be a coincidence, but it is true that your advice saved us all, Emilio chimed in. You still deserve our gratitude. We are alive because of you. The other three nodded in agreement with Emilio's words. Whether it was a coincidence or not, Mark's words saved them all. Those words let them survive and reach this far into the apocalypse. The conversation within the central hut continued for another hour. Although most of the topic afterward was mainly things around the settlement and a few questions about the mechas. Learning that the robots were called mechas from Mark, Emilio, and the others understood that he had a deeper connection with things in the background. However, no one asked any further about this connection as it was something likely related to the privileges they did not have. Mark also asked if Emilio's group knew anything about the Tomawos after the battle. However, they never encountered any Tomawo at all. Thus, it was still a mystery what exactly happened to the tribe. The conversation finally ended due to something Mark and the others forgot. Papa, I'm hungry, Abigail said, pulling the hem of Mark's clothes. They forgot lunch. Since Mark's group had been on a search since this morning, the sight of the settlement in the valley made them forget their lunch. As such, they had no choice but to end the conversation. Mark's group then decided to leave immediately. It made Emilio and the others confused. After all, they were pretty sure that lunch should come first before departing, as it would be questionable how they would have proper lunch on the way. Thus, Emilio and the others tried to invite Mark's group to lunch. However, Mark declined on the premise of not wanting to consume the limited food that Emilio's settlement had. Well, the actual reason was that Mark was pretty sure that they could eat better food on their own. Since the resources of this settlement were limited, the food they could cook would likely be subpar from what Mark's group usually ate. And thus, with everyone bidding goodbye filled with gratefulness, Mark's group departed the settlement. Many people in the settlement wanted Mark's group to stay even just a day. However, there was no way they would forcefully do it, knowing Mark's condescending attitude the first time they arrived back then. Faster than coming to the settlement, Mark's group returned to where the mini cube was parked. Fortunately, they did not return in the middle of the private activities of Ilya and Shemetris. Immediately, they prepared food and ate a late lunch. Next time, it was better not to let the girls starve despite the situation. Mark and May should reflect on this. Still, there was a bit relaxed atmosphere among the members of Mark's group this time. Despite being uncomfortable, receiving the genuine gratitude of people did not feel bad at all. It also gave Bella and Donna more information about Mark's group. But what made the sisters curious the most was the information that was not open to the public that they learned today for the first time. However, the sisters were concerned about what Mark said. One of the organizations was his enemy. They would not get dragged between this, right? Bella was pretty smart. She realized that Mark said that the Ouroboros is his enemy and not was. It meant that the hidden organization was still in operation despite the apocalypse. In any case, the sisters already had an estimate of the life they could get in Mark's base compared to other places. The current living conditions of the settlement they had just visited were ideal in the current situation of this world. However, it was completely lacking compared to Mark's place. Not to mention the security of this place. Their rough wooden walls could not be compared to the fortress walls in the mountain base. Despite the possible danger, Bella and Donna would still choose to stay. After eating lunch, Mark and the others immediately set off to continue their journey. This time, without covering the mini cube, without camouflage, they passed near the village, allowing everyone below to see the floating vessel. It caused some panic. However, those with keen eyes and the soldiers using their still working scouting equipment saw Mark sitting on the small platform at the side of the unidentified flying object. Emilio stared at the sky together with his people. Back then, Mark did introduce himself as someone connected with the generals from Luzon. It made them question many things like how and why someone from Luzon was here in the Visayas region. Now, their question was answered. The existence called Mark had the means to travel around through the apocalypse. However, that was not the last thing they understood from this. Mark, showing this to everyone, meant that he was leaving the area indefinitely. They were now left on their own, and the likelihood of Mark's group visiting again was close to nil. Since Mark did not plan on returning here any time in the near future, there was no need to hide his means of travel. This scene made some people show some discontent, unfortunately. After all, Mark had such methods, but he never showed any sign of wanting to help them more than he already did. Since Mark had something like a floating vessel, he should have the capability to bring them someplace safer. Such kind of thinking was unreasonable. However, it was human as these people could be. And this kind of thinking was the least of Mark's concerns as he had already left. They could think of anything they wanted, but it would not affect Mark in the slightest. Emilio understood that fact and could only sigh. He should think of methods to bend how his people think of this situation. Mark sat outside the platform, watching the valley settlement as it vanished behind the mountains to its north. He was sure that the people down there were now having unnecessary thoughts. If they started having bad thoughts, that was what their gratitude was all about. It would have been nice if Mark could recruit Dr. Janice or Tanya. But considering that they were now the pillars of this settlement, he retracted those thoughts. It was quite a pity, however. Mark finally managed to learn things about Dr. Janice and her mutator abilities during the conversation in the hut. It was a rather interesting one. To be able to see the flow of mutagen in people's bodies was a unique ability for sure. The ability of Dr. Janice made Mark think it was worth it to check on this place once in a while. If this place was to fall, which still had a high chance of happening, the survival chance of Emilio and those around him was still pretty high. At that time, he could recruit them if they managed to survive. Now, the detour was finished. Mark's group could fly straight towards the island of Catanduanes. There would be minor interruptions on the way, especially flying infected and feral evolved animals. It was expected and would not stop their journey. But if something interesting came up on the way, they would not hesitate to stop for a bit and see the situation. It would not hurt to find new things, especially ones that could benefit them. Similar to why Mark caught the evolved silkworm, Mark would gather anything that could be of use to them and their base. It would be nice if they came across farm animals since these kinds of animals were not only useful, but they were also less aggressive despite changing due to mutagen's influence. Mark began to wonder, would infected birds still lay eggs? If they were still biter types, the possibility of them being able to lay eggs was not zero. However, he was skeptical since he had failed his experiments on infected pregnancy in an attempt to create more blood children. Maybe, Mark should catch an infected bird when the opportunity came and feed them some laying mash since he managed to procure some from the ruined town in Murcia. Leaving the valley settlement that was not visible anymore, Mark looked forward. He wondered what he would next see on the horizon beyond them. Day 250 to 8:21 a.m. Codon Settlement, Barangay Codon, Municipality of San Andres, Province of Catanduanes. It was formerly called the Codon Military Settlement. Now, it was just the Codon Settlement with almost all military influence snuffed out of it. More than a month ago, Even before the catastrophes that changed everything happened, things in Kodan already went downhill. Lieutenant General Alfonso Padilla, the leader of Kodan military settlement, was assassinated by an unknown assailant. As several important people were reported to vanish on the same day General Padilla was killed, they became the prime suspects of the crime. However, whoever killed the general did not matter afterward. With the leader gone, all those vying for his position began the contest for control over the settlement. As soon as the contest began, everything in the settlement was thrown into disarray, and the matters of the general's death became the least of everyone's concerns. Well, for the regular people, in the least. The general's loyal supporters tried to uphold his ideals and kept going against those that tried to usurp control to the best of their capabilities. Unfortunately, the arrival of the members of the main Marcos family tilted the tide of the contention of leadership to the favor of the political faction. Soon, the conflict turned from debates into a full-blown gunfight. However, who started it was not the political faction but the faction of the Philippine Marines. In the first place, two forces of soldiers existed in the settlement, divided by the factions between the Philippine Army and the Philippine Marines. General Padilla was a general from the army and was the leader of the Kodan military settlement. It was no secret that the general of the Marines, Major General Antonino Segura, vied that position. Now that General Padilla was assassinated, the position of the settlement's leader was supposed to be handed to him as the next highest military official in the settlement. But with the political faction messing things up, he became more and more impatient. Thus, General Segura could not wait any longer and decided to use force to gain the position he deserved. Unfortunately, that was the worst decision that General Segura could have made in his entire life. The political faction was not just composed of people with no combat capabilities. The politicians might be weak in this regard, but they had money and connections in the past that allowed them to command strong people that followed them even today. And a lot of these people were experienced in things as opposed to the military's purpose for existing. Most of all, the Marcos family that arrived had the most powerful private army in the settlement with them. The political faction was not a peaceful one. However, they were a scheming group. They would not show their cards as easily as the military. They were aiming for the right chance. With General Segura raising arms to take the leadership of the settlement, the political faction followed suit. However, the political faction's actions were made under the guise of restoring peace against the Marines faction, which started the violence. As such, the political faction managed to buy the support of the blind populace. In a few days, the political faction overturned the control of the Kodan militar settlement into their hands, with General Segura also dying in the conflict. The Philippine Army faction, which was left without a legitimate leader, crumbled during the conflict. After the political faction took over, their private armies took the position of the soldiers as the protectors of the settlement. As for the remaining soldiers of the military, they were asked to choose between turning over to the political faction or leaving the settlement on their own. The loyal followers of General Padilla gathered their families and left. It was a dangerous choice. However, staying was far more dangerous for them. They took their families towards the north, aiming to try to join the neutral faction of the rebels. It was the same for those loyal to General Segura. They left the settlement. However, they went a different route from what the remaining members of the Philippine Army took. They went south, intending to reunite with the military forces stationed there. Just a few days. Everything happened in a few days, and the ruling within the Kodan settlement was passed to someone else. And then, the catastrophe occurred. Everything in the settlement crumbled, from structures to the lives of the people. Mark stood in front of a ragged old man as he listened to the story. He was currently standing within Kodan settlement, or at least, what was left of it. It was the second day after they departed from the valley settlement in Cebu. They spent one day on the journey towards this place, while another half trying to ascertain the situation on the island of Catanduanes. It was when they saw the current state of Kodan. The old settlement was gone, only leaving traces of where houses were supposedly built in the past. The remains of the settlement were walled. However, the walls the settlement had were ragged, and the wood was improperly prepared. And the living conditions were worse than the state of the walls. Many people were starving, and the remaining people of the political faction could not care less about them. Mark's group was confused as to what happened to this place. Back then, while there were conflicts, it was a bustling place. It was different now. It became a desolate area to stay in for those without the courage to venture outside. Unfortunately, it was hard to tell what happened without entering Kodan. Thus, Mark decided to infiltrate the place on his own. Mark entered Kodan's settlement without entering the gates. He then began to gather information as to what happened. Fortunately, it was not hard to get what he wanted. Mark just needed to find a random citizen in the settlement and take out a small can of sardines. They would not care who Mark was or where he came from as long as they could have something to fill their empty stomach. Thus, Mark found this old man in front of him now. It was easier to get information from someone who actually cared about their surroundings. Old people, to be exact. Besides, this old man would very likely give as much information as he could since he had his also starving grandson lying beside him, still asleep. From what Mark heard, he immediately understood what happened. The reason why this settlement was badly reduced to ruins during the fall of the space debris and the fusion of dimensions. Mark remembered what Forth told him and May during that time. The strength of the barrier was based on the unity of the people it was protecting. The more united those people were, the stronger the barrier and the less affected those inside it would be. Kodan's settlement that had just undergone a change of rule would have no chance to withstand that catastrophe. How many people managed to survive back then? Mark asked the old man. I don't really know, the old man replied, almost tearing up. I was also delirious at that time. My son and his wife also died back then, and I was left with my grandchild without knowing what to do. At that time, I had no chance to pay attention to anything else than to gather anything left of our possessions and find a way to bury my son and his wife. Mark stared at the old man with a sigh. It was understandable that the old man could recall everything before the catastrophe and everything else afterward was blurry. The old man lost 2 of his 3 remaining family members while everything else around them was destroyed. It was also possible that he and his grandchild were injured at that time, seeing that he and the child actually had new similar-looking scars on their bodies. They probably got buried inside their home due to the earthquake. If it was the other people in the same situation as this old man, they could have gone insane already. This old man was strong in his own way. All right, it's enough, I guess. Mark said, deciding to end the conversation here. Sir, are you really giving me food for answering your questions? The old man asked Mark. Don't worry, I don't go against my words. Mark replied as he removed his backpack and lowered it to the ground. He then opened it and began taking items out of it. Then, under the shocked eyes of the old man, Mark took out 6 large cans of sardines, 4 packs of imported chocolate, a large gallon of mineral water, a small pack of meat jerky, 3 packs of sweet candies, and 2 jars of peanut butter. The old man stared in shock, seeing all the things Mark took out. When he agreed to answer Mark's questions in exchange for food, he expected at least a small packet of crackers. He never expected this much. And most of all, how in the world did all this stuff fit inside this man's barely filled backpack? In the end, Mark took a folded sack out of his bag and handed it to the old man. Can you store this stuff yourself? Mark said. I'm pretty sure you don't want others to see these. When Mark said that, the old man snapped back to reality and looked around. Fortunately, they were in a secluded area at the corner of the settlement. It was not the safest place to be, but there were fewer people bothering them. Sir, are you really giving all this to us? The old man asked Mark, still unable to believe what he was seeing. Just think of it as a bonus for answering my questions truthfully. Mark replied with a smile. Thank you. Thank you. The old man finally cried as he slowly gathered the stuff Mark gave into the sack. Due to the old man's cry of gratitude, his grandson was woken up. Grandpa, why are you crying? The kid asked his grandfather while rubbing his sleepy eyes. Then, the child's eyes widened as he saw the food that his grandfather was trying to put into the sack. Foe! The child almost yelled, but the old man managed to cover the kid's mouth in time. Shish! The old man hushed the kid. Help me put these into the sack. Quote. The kid understood why his grandfather stopped him and hurriedly helped store the items into the sack. But the kid was confused. Grandpa, where did the food come from? The kid asked. Why are you asking? It was the old man's turn to be confused. It was given to us by this kind S. The old man did not finish his sentence. He looked up only to see no one in front of him. Surprised, the old man immediately looked around. However, he saw no one. If not for the fact that he had the items given to him just now, he would think that it was a hallucination due to hunger. But no, there was definitely a man here just now, and he gave this food and water in exchange for some information that any people around could give. The old man wiped his tears and began praying inside his mind. He was thankful for the charity given to them, no matter who was the man who gave it. Whether it was an angel or a devil, the old man was grateful. Mark left the old man and the kid on their own. He already got most information he needed and paid for it. The only thing left to know was the current state of this place. As Mark walked away from where the old man was, he soon stopped. Mark was surrounded. What do you people want? Mark nonchalantly said, without a shred of emotion, while glancing at the 5 men that surrounded him. We saw you giving food to that old man, one of the men said as he raised his knife. Give us everything you have. Or else. Or else, what? Mark shrugged. Don't try to say anything. Another one of the men argued with the first one. Just kill him. We will get everything he had after that. I see. Mark sighed. Kill me. Huh. Like this. As Mark said that, the man that yelled to just kill Mark froze with his eyes opened wide. In front of the other 4 men's shocked eyes, the head of that man slid off from his neck. With a thud, the headless body fell to the ground with the bloody head rolling somewhere else. The remaining 4 men were horrified. They knew they offended someone they should not have. And thus, the first thing they had in mind was to run. However, their feet would just not move. Unfortunately, I can't really leave any witnesses. I can't have anyone stealing the things I gave to that old man, you guys see. Mark said with his eyes glowing bright red. The 4 men began yelling for help, trying to get anyone's attention to the place. For some reason, begging for their lives was not something they thought of doing. Maybe, they already knew that begging would be useless. Unfortunately for these men, no one would be able to hear them. All sounds were already blocked from coming out ever since Mark left the old man. The death cries of the 4 men were left unheard as the 5 notorious thieves vanished that morning without leaving a trace. Day 250 to 10:48 a.m. Codon Settlement, Barangay Codon, Municipality of San Andres, Province of Catanduanes. After removing the trash, Mark continued to wander around the settlement. He tried to be as inconspicuous as he could be, not letting people unnecessarily see him. Mark even called out the photokinesis mental crystal, and covered himself with optical camouflage. This method might alert magically sensitive creatures and people if he got too close, but it was way better than easily being seen as suspicious by the people of the settlement. And as more time Mark spent around Codon settlement, the more he learned about the things that happened here. Although it was known that the political faction now ruled the settlement, it was in name only. It was because most of the members of the faction had already perished, and the main perpetrators of the rule change were no exception. Mark found another older person, now a woman without one of her feet. The missing feet seemed to be amputated from the knee downward. She had no relatives left and could not do anything to feed herself anymore. However, the people around her had yet to give up on her. While the people taking care of her were away to find anything to eat, Mark took the opportunity and started a conversation with her. The old woman was wary of Mark, a stranger who looked no less than a mercenary or a criminal. However, as Mark remained a proper safe distance between them as they conversed, the wariness slowly vanished. This woman knew more than the old man from before. Apparently, she was already left alone long before the catastrophe began and had nothing else to lose. The people taking care of her now were actually people who she tried to save during the earthquake. The people she helped survived, but it was in exchange for her currently missing foot. From the old woman, Mark learned of the current situation in the settlement. As mentioned before, the settlement was under the political faction's rule only in name. The actual rulers of this place now were the members of the private armies raised by the deceased politicians, now led by the mercenaries hired by the same people. When Mark learned of this, it became clear why the state of this place was a mess. Politicians could be greedy for power, but they would show otherwise to people. As such, to maintain support and power, they would, in turn, make the people believe in them. Since these people could not rise into their positions without using their intelligence, they knew that providing things for the people would help the settlement in the long run. Making the people willingly follow their lead would likely result in a better state of the settlement. But because it was now led by the members of the politicians, private armies and mercenaries with less knowledge about politics and how to manage the common people, the settlement was an utter mess. These people only believed in strength and money. They would care less about the weak. But what happened? How was it possible that the core members of the political faction just all died? It was because of selfishness. A retreat bunker was constructed under the ground of the military zone of the settlement. The construction was started right after the Kodon military settlement was established and was prioritized over many things. It was not that large of a building, only enough to let around 100 people inside with a bit of space for emergency supplies. Due to its small size, the military managed to finish its construction in a little bit more than 5 months since it started. If they managed to follow the architectural blueprint correctly, it should be able to withstand a couple of explosions before collapsing. It would also allow 50 people to live inside it for a few months in isolation. It was not wrong to say that it was the sturdiest structure in the settlement, even compared to the defensive walls outside. And when the soldiers were ousted from the settlement, this underground bunker fell into the hands of the politicians. When the catastrophe came, as the space debris fell onto Earth, all the politicians took refuge in the bunker. Well, most of them. Although the bunker could fit 100 people, the ideal number was actually less than half for a comfortable and safer stay. Thus, the politicians with less power were forced out of the bunker. It was the same for most of the mercenaries and members of the private armies they raised. Of course, it was not something that went smoothly. Those already inside did not want to get out. As such, those people had to be forced to move out. It became a violence-filled eviction where the loser could only retreat outside the bunker. The violence ended soon. It was not when the intended results were achieved, but when the shockwaves forced those inside to close the gates of the bunker. Shockwaves from the fall of the space debris destroyed almost everything within the settlement. The defensive walls collapsed as they were blown away, while houses and tents were toppled to ruins. Even the docks were torn to pieces by the raging waves. Fortunately, the underground bunker would only suffer a few strong shakes since it was built underground. Furthermore, while they suffered shockwaves from nearby crashes of space debris, no direct hit happened due to the invisible barrier that protected everyone. This caused the bunker to stay standing. And then, the error came. The space debris was one thing, but no one expected the incoming earthquake of unprecedented strength. Before anyone inside the bunker could even go out, it collapsed. Even the bunker did not manage to withstand the violently shaking ground despite supposedly being able to endure explosions. It might be due to a lapse in the hastened construction. No one would know. Did all the people inside the bunker die immediately? No one would be able to answer. None bothered to do any kind of rescue either. After all, Everyone outside was those who were betrayed and ousted by those inside the bunker. In order to selfishly save themselves, they were the ones who died instead. Mark had an eerie sneer as he thought of such. Those guys definitely deserved their deaths, and karma struck them when they least expected it. That event must have been a beautiful sight as they all regretted their decision to enter that bunker while they desperately struggled to live. When things subsided, more than half of the settlement's population was lost. Many mourned the deaths of their remaining family members. As for the fate of the political faction, it was clear to see. Their core members, and all of the Marcos family, were buried inside the bunker. All that was left outside were those powerless politicians who had no control over the remaining mercenaries and private armies of those who died. And those mercenaries and private soldiers. They were angry as they were thrown away at the last moment. There was no way they would follow any other politician nor be led by those without strength. That was when the remaining mercenaries and private soldiers decided to take control of what remained of the settlement. In the first place, they were the only ones left who could fight the threats outside. For the same reason, all the people left within the settlement had no other choice but to follow the new rulers of the settlement. There was nothing else they could do, and those who opposed the new rule could only face death. From then on, the Kodan settlement became a place where the strong ruled and the weak would follow. If the weak want to live peacefully, they must remain silent and follow those above them without question. With that rule being followed, the weak were living silently in their current unsightly conditions. Still, it was way better than being killed. Not to mention that while their living conditions were not optimal, they were not being treated as slaves forcefully pushed into dangerous labor. Unfortunately, as if this place was cursed to suffer, history began to repeat itself. The Kodan settlement was currently being ruled by the mercenaries and the private soldiers. However, these two kinds of people were different in their own ways. Mercenaries were hired using money and other valuable resources. Money was their god, and they could stoop low in order to get things they wanted. On the other hand, the private soldiers were different. Although they were discarded by the politicians in the worst moment, the innocent people had nothing to do with their anger. In the first place, not all of them were serving the politicians because they wanted to. Most of them were forced to be loyal due to circumstances they could not handle. Now, they were free, and they were understanding of the current situation of the common people. Unfortunately, many of these private soldiers were raised as such, starting when they were young. Their knowledge in other fields was basically non-existent as they were raised with nothing but the ability to fight. As such, they were barely of any help with the current state of the settlement. With the two kinds of people having different ideals, two factions were once more created, contending against each other over the rule of this dilapidated place. Not to mention there were also the soldiers from the military that did not leave. Those chose to be under the politicians instead. Although they could not make a faction of their own, they still had some influence over the people now that the politicians were mostly gone. What a mess, Mark said as he heard the details. A mess that no one could clean, the old woman said with a little chuckle. Unfortunately, we can only live like this. Although it might change if someone like you intervened, perhaps. The old woman's words made Mark tilt his head as he asked. So, you recognize me, huh? Mark already realized that the old woman was slowly warming up to him for some reason as they conversed. It was unlike when he first approached her. The savior of that night when the infected rose from the sea, and the dragon rider, the old woman proudly declared. I was watching that time closely. I lived near the docks before and saw what happened clearer than others. The woman then pointed at her eyes, having a bit of a greenish hue. This woman was not a mutator, but likely an evolver, with a rather unique eye ability like May had. I can see better and farther at night due to these eyes, you see. I was also there when you and your people left on the dragon's back, the woman said. Although I was unsure earlier, I managed to recognize you as I observed. You're not asking me to meddle with the situation here, are you? Mark asked. The information you gave won't be enough as a payment for that. Ha ha. The old woman laughed without regard that her mouth with barely any teeth left was showing. You can probably make some change, but I won't ask that. This mess is our problem, brought by ourselves. Outsiders better mind their own business. Just the food you promised in exchange should be enough. Mark was rather amazed at this old woman's outlook. She sure was a mentally strong person. Although she hinted that Mark's intervention could possibly do something, she was not begging Mark for it. Staring at the woman, Mark could only shrug. There was nothing much for Mark to ask now that the outline of the situation here became clear to him. As such, he fulfilled his end of the bargain. He gave the woman food and water, similar to what he gave the old man earlier. However, instead of tearing up, like the old man, the old woman smiled and thanked Mark gracefully. Nonetheless, it seemed this old woman would not keep these supplies for herself. It would not be a surprise if she only shared it with the people taking care of her, but it seemed that she wanted to share it with other people too. Mark gave another shrug as some footsteps were heard approaching them. It seemed that the people taking care of the old woman had returned and their voices made her turn. In this opportunity, Mark vanished, making the old woman show a bitter smile. She seemed to be hoping to introduce Mark to the people taking care of her, but he just left mysteriously. With the investigation basically finished, Mark made his way out of the settlement. However, not far from the walls of the settlement, Mark could not help but stop as a child with dark skin came zooming in his direction. Day 250 to 11:52 a.m. Codon Settlement, Barangay Codon, Municipality of San Andres, Province of Catanduanes. Mark was about to leave Codon Settlement and return to where May and the others were waiting. It was almost lunchtime, after all, not to mention there was barely any reason for Mark to stay here. He already got most of the information he wanted and did not want to meddle any deeper in some business he was not supposed to involve himself. However, Mark could not help but stop when something fast-moving entered his detection range. Furthermore, it was someone he recognized. And as soon as Mark detected the presence, it was already zooming towards him, in a literal sense. The person moved with only a blur left on their trail. It was as if they ran without regard to the existence of space, tearing through it. Mark understood the principle as to how that person moved. Not only did he already experience traveling with that person's kind, but he also had a similar ability. There was no need to wait. The owner of the presence appeared in front of Mark immediately. A black-skinned child that was not human despite looking like one. It was a Yasa, a magical race only found in the myths from the island of Catanduanes. Furthermore, the one that appeared in front of Mark was Darielio, the leader and the eldest of the Yasas. Although it was a good question as to how Darielio knew Mark was here. But for Darielio to come himself, something important must be going on. Still, it could also be because only Darielio could properly converse in both human and spirit languages among his kind. When Mark looked at the Yasa, however, he immediately disregarded the latter thought. Darielio might not look panicked, but he sure was in a worry. Furthermore, even though they now see Mark and his group as allies, these magical creatures would rather choose not to approach a demon. It just meant that while the reason was important, it was not too urgent. Dewata Araya needed your presence, Darielio said as soon as he stopped in front of Mark. Come as soon as possible. And after saying those words, without waiting for any kind of reply from Mark, Darielio zoomed away. Mark could only frown and sigh while scratching his head. The unique abilities of Yasas, enabling them to travel fast to different places, would make them effective messengers. Only if they actually talked properly. Or maybe, just let them deliver letters. It would be way better than an awkward encounter like this one. Even if Darielio did not want to interact with Mark too much, it would not hurt if he answered a question or two. Now, Mark was left wondering if he had to go there immediately or not. Although the message seemed to be a request, the way it was delivered sounded like an order. Shaking his head and shrugging his shoulders, Mark decided to return to his group first. At the beach west of Kodon settlement, the mini cube was parked near the edge of the sandy coast. Outside were the members of Mark's group, preparing lunch. This was the same beach where they had a picnic lunch the last time they were here in Katandwanas. However, the scenery had already changed. And unfortunately, the rocky area that concealed the giant hermit crab was no longer present. It made them wonder where the giant hermit crab went to. Did it manage to survive? Or was it already dead? No one would know since it was not here, nor was any clue left of its fate. Mark arrived several minutes after noon. Lunch was ready, and they only needed to eat together, as per usual. However, someone was yet to arrive. It was Feng Zhiro, who almost had no presence since they departed Mount Madia as. She's out again. Mark asked the others, and they could only turn in a certain direction. At the edge of the beach where the waves hit the sand, Feng Zhiro could be seen. She was waving her sword with the sunlight flashing on its blade. With every slash of her sword, one could feel how much effort she put into the things she learned from both her sect and the things she gained from Mark's teachings. Mark was no expert in swords himself. But with fragmented memories that he gained from Feng Zhirio's elder, he managed to teach her better than what her sect would teach an errant disciple like her. Feng Zhiro never lacked talent or effort. It was teaching that she lacked the most. Something that the sect would not give to disciples below a certain level. But currently, a certain event brought a heavy impact on Feng Zhiro. The Trial of Regrets. During the trial that Magwayan orchestrated for them, everyone had to relive their regrets with erased memories, measuring how strong their attachment to their current lives. And the only person that did not pass the trial within Mark's group was Feng Zhiro. It was not surprising. Feng Zhiro had to relive the past when her village was slaughtered along with her family members. The scene of seeing the corpses of one's family members was not something most people would be able to overcome no matter how many times they relived it. And that was the biggest regret of Feng Zhiro. She was not there when her village was attacked. And even if she was, her strength at that time was not enough to stop the event from happening. Worse, she would be one of the victims of that massacre. The trial of regrets made Feng Zhiro relive such a traumatic event, and it opened her past emotional wounds. Now, she became more silent and dedicated to her sword so that nothing of such event would happen once more around her. It was both a good and bad thing for her. The current mindset of Feng Zhiro had caused her to want to train more to improve her base strength and skills rather than just raising her cultivation. However, it also made her mind unable to focus on other things, such as the situation like now, lunch. Feng Zhiro also became uninterested in many things unless it was fighting and learning or developing new techniques. Boom! An explosion occurred, causing the seawater to scatter towards the direction Feng Zhiro stabbed her sword. She actually managed to do it, huh? Mark commented after seeing the stabbing technique that Feng Zhiro had just displayed. Although Feng Zhirio's sect, the Tianlin Longgong or Heavenly Blue Dragon Palace, was known as a sword sect, their techniques were focused on slashing. Even the sword techniques she learned from the sect were low-level slashing attacks. The stabbing techniques that Feng Zhiro was displaying were actually Mark's originals. Using the memories from the elder, Mark developed some stabbing techniques, although he could not really use them due to his lack of cultivation. However, Mark's techniques, although self-made, followed the principles of Feng Zhirio's way of cultivation. As such, she could use it with practice, just like how she just did the new technique he called explosive sword stab. The simple name was more or less the proof that it was Mark's original. Most of the techniques that Feng Zhiro knew had unnecessarily fancy and long names that were both too embarrassing and inconvenient to use in the modern culture, even though all of them were weak techniques. Still, Mark's naming sense was quite peculiar itself. After all, it was influenced by video games, anime, and novels. Sometimes, he would give absurd names to things, especially the equipment and items he created. But in terms of techniques, he chose to be more practical. "I'll call her," Mei said as she went to Feng Zhiro. Mark nodded. It was also better if Feng Zhiro stopped for now. By the looks of it, she was not paying attention to her surroundings and forgot that the explosion could attract unnecessary attention. The two girls returned, and Feng Zhiro apologized for the delay. The group then ate their lunch as Mark shared what he learned about the current situation in Kodan settlement. And after learning that the Kodan settlement's current state was caused by greed and infighting between humans, Ilya could not help but sneer while Feng Zhiro sighed. Humans had both good and bad sides. However, when the bad happened, the no intention of taking responsibility. In this case, however, the perpetrators were already dead. Although they died horribly, they also escaped the suffering caused by the consequences of their actions. After talking about the situation in Kodan settlement, Mark told everyone their next move. "We're going to the mountains after lunch," Mark declared. "When I left the settlement, Yusa told me to meet the Dewata on this island." Another one. Ilya could not help but comment. Why are there a lot of those nature women in this country? Nature women. It was what Ilya called those Dewatas due to their pure energy that represented nature itself. They had the same energy as forest nymphs and dryads, although much purer and stronger. Dewatas are only found in this country as far as I know, Mark shrugged. Their original race was created by Bathala, after all. And their number isn't really large. Just how many did we meet so far compared to the number of other races? So far, Mark had met 6 Dewatas, if the remaining fragment of the ancient Dewata did not count. Compared to other races with members numbering from a few hundred to several thousand, a population of 6 was a really small number. Did something happen? May asked Mark with a bit of worry. There was no need to say that she was quite fond of Ilya, Mark's ancestor. Don't know. Mark shrugged his shoulders. The messenger did not say anything else and left immediately. You know, the magical races here did not like demons. May nodded in response. Their group might have been allowed to the sanctuary due to the fact that they were related to Ilya and Jenny through Mark. However, most of the magical races on this island despised demons. They hated demons but called for you. Ilya smirked. Anyway, how did they even know you were on this island? We just arrived yesterday and met no one. This area is within their territory, Mark said as he pointed in a direction. They have eyes everywhere. Mark pointed at a patch of trees quite a distance away from them. There really was someone hiding there, and they immediately vanished after knowing they had been noticed. You saw, May said as she got a glimpse of the figure using her eyes. The others only saw a blur, however. What a fast child, Ilya said, noticing the appearance of the creature. They might look and behave like children, but they're not, Mark explained. I'm pretty sure they're a race only found on this island. Ilya and Shemetris looked at each other and seemed to agree with what Mark said. The two had never seen any other race in other countries that had a similar appearance to the Yusas. The discussion continued as they ate lunch of stewed vegetables and meat. Then, after tidying up, they left the beach using the mini cube and flew inland. Although they spent almost a day assessing the situation on the island, it was hard to say that they saw every nook and cranny of the island in that time span. At most, they found the locations of settlements of both humans and magical creatures near the coastal areas. As for the things inland and in the middle of the mountains, they had yet to see the place. And just when they were halfway towards their destination, they noticed something large moving in the mountains in the east. Was it another behemoth-class infected? Unfortunately, no. After all, no infected would look like a four-legged, prism-shaped robot the size of a cargo ship. Day 250 to 1:23 p.m. Barangay Gaimlong, Municipality of Karamoran, Province of Catanduanes. Everyone was surprised by the scene that none of them had expected. Even Mark and Shemetris were no exception. As for Bella and Donna, they were shocked to their core. A giant quadruped mechid, with a prism-shaped body, more than 300 meters in length and standing around 20 to 30 meters, was slowly moving around the mountains. Its body seemed to be made of light-colored metal and had a rather sleek design on its shape. It was the largest mechid that the group had seen so far, not to mention that it was second to the crocodile form of Sinogo in terms of size compared to everything they had encountered since the apocalypse started. And this scene definitely did not make sense in the eyes of those who understood that situation. The mechids came crashing to Earth after the space debris exploded to pieces. If this thing fell onto this place with that size, it could decimate the whole island of Katandwanas into a sea of flames, and nothing would be left alive. Even the fusion of dimensions would not be able to stop such an event from happening. However, the island was intact and perfectly fused with its counterpart in the spirit dimension. But as they were in denial of that possibility, Mark noticed something. The mountainous basin that the giant mechid was walking around looked like a crater. It was just that the fusion of dimensions immediately covered the crater with everything that came from the spirit dimension, making it hard to discern that it was actually a crater. Then, did this gigantic thing really fall here from space? If that was the case, how did the island survive the impact? Mark began calculating things in his mind, giving his face a deep frown. There were many possibilities, but there was barely any concrete evidence to support any, and most of them contradicted each other. It was also possible that this giant mechid did land on this island, considering how much destruction the settlement of Kodan suffered before the earthquake started. It was just that Fourth maintained the island from getting destroyed completely. This was the most plausible explanation that Mark could think of so far. Doesn't it look like it's trapped? Ilya said, noticing something. As Ilya said, the giant mechid seemed to be trying to traverse out of the crater but failing to do so. It might have become mountainous, but the crater was still deeper than the normal land height of this island, adding to the height of the mountains surrounding the crater. Furthermore, the giant mechid was moving sluggishly. It was not wrong to say that there was a chance that the fastest man in history could outrun it on foot. It's broken, May said, with her eyesight clearly zoomed towards the body of the giant mechid. There's a lot of parts around its joints that had cracks, and wires are hanging out. There are also holes and missing spaces all over its body. Crackle. All of a sudden, everyone had to cover their eyes due to a bright flash of light. The giant mechid seemed to be trying to traverse the steep crater, only to cause its right front leg to release bright sparks of electricity. Not only that, but it almost toppled itself to the ground. Splat. As they looked once more, large amounts of black liquid began pouring out of the broken leg of the mechid. It was something present in all mechids. It was still unconfirmed as to what this liquid was, but Mark suspected it to be produced by the mechid pathogen. It was also possibly what was controlling the mechids. Now that they saw it, they could not help but notice the skid marks all around the crater. Those marks were not hard to see, considering that the areas were bare with trees heavily trampled and broken. It seemed that this giant mechid was trying to escape its natural prison all this time, only to fail again and again. The crater was also stained with that black liquid, proving how the giant mechid was heavily broken down. The black liquid also showed severe effects on the flora it covered. The trees inside the crater were all dying, seemingly poisoned to their roots. It can't see us here, can it? Bella asked in worry. The sisters had several encounters with mechids while helping fight the infected near Mt. Canlayan. These alien robots were really hard to fight despite their small size and rarity. They could fire lasers, bulletproof, and the powders the sisters could release had no effect on them. If this big thing could do the same, just how powerful would it be? I don't think it can. We're currently invisible outside, Mark replied before turning to Ilya and Shemetris. Just in case, let's fly further away. We barely know anything about the mechids. It's possible that some of them have thermal sensors. Everyone agreed with what Mark said. So far, the giant mechid had yet to detect them since they were still far away. However, there was no benefit in risking it. It was better to be careful since they knew nothing about this mechid at all. Who would know? This giant mechid might have an arsenal of hundreds of lasers around its body, or worse, a wave motion cannon. Luckily, it's trapped, Spera said as they slowly flew further away from the crater. If not, this island could be gone long ago. The others could only agree to Spera's words. If that thing was released, it would possibly pose a threat no less than Sinogo, even in its current heavily broken state. Looks like we found another goal to do on this island. Mark shrugged as he said those words. He really did not want to deal with something at a similar scale to Sinogo in his current state. While his body had recovered its strength, his miasma, his main weapon, was still too minuscule. But then, the light bulb above Mark's head lit up as he suddenly turned to look at the giant mechid once more. The miasma in Mark's body could convert and absorb any kind of energy into its own. However, the most efficient kind of energy for it to absorb was magical energy. On the other hand, other kinds of energy, like heat or light, would not really give that much miasma compared to the amount absorbed. It was too inefficient that Mark would not bother at all. Mark could probably behave like a plant and just absorb sunlight, but it would be more of a waste of time than actually finding another way to increase his miasma. However, what about that giant mechid? What kind of energy and how much was needed to allow something that big to continue moving? If Mark managed to get a hold of that mechid's energy source, was it possible for Mark to recover a significant amount of his miasma? Gerger, you're thinking of something dangerous again, aren't you? May's voice entered Mark's ears in an annoyed tone. It was not only May. Everyone in the mini cube was staring at Mark in exasperation. Bella and Donna might be oblivious to it since they were new to the group, but the others could already tell from time to time when Mark had something ridiculous inside his mind. Mark shrugged in silence. He had no chance to win here. Likewise, they would have to destroy that giant mechid sooner or later. Like Sinogo, it could pose a threat. And not only to this island but to the entire country if they left the mechid alone for too long. In the least, it would not be going anywhere anytime soon. It was in a broken state and would definitely not be able to repair its own since it seemed to have stayed that way all this time. Still, it was not right to be complacent as they had no idea what kinds of things the giant mechid would be capable of. While it could be nothing but a giant broken piece of junk, it could also be a gigantic fortress capable of launching barrages of laser beams. It was not like it could pose that much of a threat compared to Sinogo. There was also no way that it would penetrate through the defensive capabilities of Chimetrice. But now that Mark had something in mind, he would rather plan things instead, or they might accidentally end up destroying everything without getting anything at all. The mini cube flew away from the crater and straight up north. Their destination should be just a few mountains away. After a few more minutes of flight, their destination was now in sight. Yes, on sight, to Mark and May's surprise. Dewata Araya and the magical creatures of this island lived in a magical domain away from the prying eyes of the mortal realm. They still lived that way last time Mark's group visited this island. But now, the entirety of Dewata Araya's secret domain was now laid bare for everyone to see. And unlike the beautiful and peaceful mountain sanctuary it was before, it was now a magical mountain filled with defensive structures and fortifications. Furthermore, all the life in the mountain was now concentrated in a large village near the peak, unlike before, where the magical creatures under the Dewata were living all over the mountain. As the mini cube flew closer to the village, Mark disabled the optical camouflage that hid it in the sky. Of course, the sudden appearance of a floating vessel in the sky alerted everyone below. The village immediately gathered the warriors to prepare to defend it. Even Dewata Araya and the other core members of this magical group came out in a hurry. And to their confusion, the floating vessel in the sky just floated there without moving closer or leaving. It was when two figures alighted from the vessel, alerting the people below. But even just the silhouette of the winged man in the sky, Aaliyah immediately recognized her beloved descendant. Mark and May landed in front of everyone. Only when they recognized the two that they put down their weapons. Aaliyah, Mark's ancestor, approached the two before anyone else. It was no doubt that she was excited to meet Mark and May once again. And there, the two were enveloped in a loving embrace. Welcome back. I missed you too. Aaliyah tearfully welcomed the two. I am glad that you two are fine. Mark and May could only look at each other with a smile while being embraced by Aaliyah. Aaliyah was the only person they could call family that could shower them with love this way. When was the last time the two remembered being embraced by their parents? The two could not remember. All Mark and May remembered were the times they were being scolded for minor mistakes and their lives being dictated to them. Aaliyah's treatment of them sure gave them a warm and refreshing feeling. Aaliyah, Dawada Araya did not want to break the happy reunion, but she had no choice as she called Aaliyah. You can spend time with them later, but we have other important things to address right at this moment. Aaliyah turned her head towards the Dawada and sighed as she let go of Mark and May. Still, she held the hands of the two as if fearing that they would suddenly run away. This time, everyone just let her continue holding the hands of Mark and May. Mark, Dawada Araya called Mark and turned to the sky. What is that thing? Our transport. We had the opportunity to get something we can use to travel instead of riding on the dragon's back, which is pretty uncomfortable. Mark nonchalantly replied. The complete opposite of the reaction he gave to Aaliyah's embrace. I see. Dawada Araya did not mind Mark's nonchalant reply and looked more interested in the floating vessel in the sky. Can I call it down? Mark asked that Dawada. The rest of our group this time is still there. We just stopped since you guys might attack. Dawada Araya then signaled her warriors to stand down and return to their work, leaving only a few as her usual guards. It was only when Mark signaled for the mini cube to land. But at this time, Aaliyah suddenly blocked Mark while looking at him with worried eyes. What happened to you? Mark's great ancestor asked him, seemingly noticing both the good and bad changes in Mark's body. Day 250 to 3:21 p.m., Unnamed Mountain, Katandwanas. What happened to you? For Aaliyah to immediately notice the changes that happened to Mark clearly showed how she valued Mark as her descendant and family. However, it was not only Mark who had some drastic changes. Mark and May could not help but notice the leader of this place, Dawada Araya. While Mark was weakened due to his miasma being minuscule at this moment, Dawada Araya currently barely had an ounce of magical energy in her body. Thus, the question that Aaliyah just asked Mark could also apply to Dawada Araya. Can I answer that question later? Mark gently replied with a bitter smile. Aaliyah stared shortly at Mark's left eye, which had a tinge of a purplish color, and nodded. It should be a long story and something that was not suitable to be shared here in the open. The mini cube then landed with Mark's signal. Everyone from the village sure was both curious and wary of the giant floating thing. Then, the members of Mark's group alighted, with the lively Sylph in the lead, followed the three little girls some residents of this place were familiar with. But aside from those four, the remaining 5 members who came out were unfamiliar to them. Not to mention 3 things. Everyone was surprised as they felt Amihan's strong aura. It was the same for the gorgeous woman and the handsome muscular man that Mark brought. Still, Dawada Araya and those strongest among her entourage could not help but feel wary towards Ilya and Shemetris. After all, Ilya was a demon, and Shemetris was something they could not fathom what he was.
In the least, Mark's family already proved that they were not enemies. It was not the same for these two. As for Amihan, the nearby Sylphs could not help but become awed by the strong aura she was leaking. They were a weak race, and it was something that everyone knew. It was very rare among their race to grow strong, physically and magically. Yet, there was Amihan, who could possibly top everyone else in their race in terms of magical power. Unfortunately, the attention she was gathering caused Amihan to be uncomfortable. Before any of her race could approach her, she flew towards Mark and sat on his shoulder. Now, no one would approach her due to the natural aura around Mark, which caused people to stay away from him. Mark could only shrug a little, knowing that Amihan was using him as a shield. However, it was inevitable as Amihan could barely control her current strength, and there was no way to hide her aura. At least, for now. Even Mark was finding ways to hide his own aura, as it could be inconvenient if just any magical creature they encountered could tell that they were demons. With everyone finally gathered, they were invited into the village. Unlike the usual primitive villages, the village on this mountain was special. Since they had a few dryads, and Dewata Araya's primary power was of nature, they used their control over plants and trees to create houses, walls, and other things necessary for the village. Where could one see a tall watchtower that was built with giant vines? So far, Mark's group only saw these kinds of structures here. In one way or another, the maintenance of this place was extremely efficient. Any damage could be restored with just a flick of the hands of the dryads. Unfortunately, fire would be the bane of this place. However, it was not much of a worry. Most of the races here only eat fruits, vegetables, and herbs, while the meat-eaters were not keen on putting their food over the fire, preferring their high-protein diet raw. There were also those who did not need to eat, as their bodies only had to absorb energy from their surroundings to live. And also, because of the presence of the dryads, food was less of an issue in this place. They could accelerate the growth of fruit-bearing plants, although the speed might vary depending on the type of flora. Having more than one dryad sure helped a lot in this. As for those who eat meat, they could hunt for themselves since they had the ability to do so. Of course, things would go smoothly if not for the fact that there were threats everywhere in the current situation on Earth. Despite the unique appearance of the village, it still followed the usual defensive formation where the leaders and most important people lived at its center. And it was where the members of Mark's group were brought. Along the way, Bella and Donna were curiously looking around. This kind of fantasy-like scenery was the least of the things they expected to see, especially when the apocalypse started. Who would have thought that joining Mark's group would lead them to such strange but magnificent places? Unfortunately, the house-shaped tree at the center of the village was off-limits to most people. Here, only those trusted by Dewata Araya and those who were invited would be allowed to enter unless it was an emergency. Aside from Mark's family of 5 and Amihan, other members of Mark's group were people unfamiliar to the residents of this place. As such, they were not allowed to the Dewata's dwelling. It was reasonable, and they did not complain, although Spera showed an annoyed expression while being brought to another hut nearby. Mark watched the annoyed Spera as they went in a separate direction. She was not saying anything, but she would definitely start rambling her complaints sooner or later. After all, Spera had no breaks when it came to expressing her emotions ever since Mark took away her inherited psychast in the past. Led by Dewata Araya, Mark and the rest followed inside the house-shaped tree. It was a simple house with barely any furniture, but upon entry, the smell of herbs and the crystals that littered the house showed why this place was prohibited. It was not just the house of Dewata Araya but also a place for her to recuperate. Dewata Araya sat on the central seat made of vines and giant leaves. Then, with a wave of her hand, the vines inside the house began moving, forming chairs and a table for everyone to sit around. There were only a few people around as Dewata Araya only called for a select few to join the conversation. There was Aliyah, currently doting on the little girls. Mark's aunt, Jenny. The Tamawo, Ordulk. The cursed armor, Morlkill, stood at the side. And lastly, the ball of light, Bituin, flying over Dewata Araya's shoulder. The leader of the Yasas was not present. It was not that surprising since they were creatures that were more of a servant than leading figures. Now, answer my question. Aliyah demanded, wanting to know what her descendant was up to, causing these changes on his body. While the changes were not actually noticeable unless one paid close attention to Mark, the one thing that changed a lot was the eerie aura around him. The aura that lingered around Mark due to being a high-level empath was still there. However, the strange feeling he gave out due to the miasma in his body greatly diminished. Those with a high level of magical perception, such as the people in this room, would not fail to notice that. Not to mention that the amount of miasma Mark had before was a whole lot after absorbing the energy that Lord Cease conjured. Now, There was barely any trace of miasma on Mark's aura. Mark let out another shrug. He wanted to know why a messenger was sent to him by Dewata Araya, but it would not hurt to address what Aaliyah wanted first. Thus, Mark recalled the important bits of information in his journey, starting from when he left this island before the second wave began. However, the story Mark began to tell felt too unbelievable that they could not help but turn to Bituin to confirm some things. Unfortunately for them, Bituin confirmed that none of what Mark said were lies. Aaliyah could not help but feel her heart beating louder as she learned of the dangerous things that happened to Mark in their short time of separation. However, Aaliyah could not reprimand Mark either for his actions or decisions. The existence of an infected deity was not something anyone could ignore. If left alone for too long, it would become a disaster none of them would be able to handle. Mark's actions were backed by legitimate reasons. Still, Aaliyah and Jenny could not help but frown, having someone from their family brave such dangers. On the other hand, Dewata Araya felt relieved. More than a week ago, I felt a powerful fluctuation coming from the southwest. I was afraid that a strange anomaly was happening. Fortunately, my worries were answered on a positive note. From what Dewata Araya said, it seemed that the magical fluctuations of that battle reached far and wide and were felt by powerful beings such as Dewata Araya. It made Mark wonder if there were other beings that felt it. Unfortunately, there was no way for Mark to know. Seriously, why do you have to brave such a thing? Aaliyah said to Mark, looking at his darkened right arm. It's not like we have any other options, right? Mark replied. It's either us or someone else. And even though we needed a bit of luck to win, that someone might not be so lucky as us. Besides, if we let that guy swallow up Mount Canlone, he might be rampaging here already at this time. Silence permeated the room. Although what Mark said was mere speculation, it was not unlikely to happen. Still, Aaliyah's was heavy knowing that Mark and May faced such danger. It was also a surprise to hear what Chimetris was. Of course, the surprise was accompanied by a bit of fear since Chimetris was a being created to oppose gods. Normally, information like what Chimetris was should remain a secret. However, if it would ease Aaliyah's worry even a little, it should be fine. Besides, it was not like it would matter much whether they knew or not. Still, Mark made sure not to divulge the story about Amihan. The anti-god weapon Chimetris was one thing, but someone related to a god, even just an incarnation, was a huge thing to Dewatas. Thus, he decided not to say anything much about Amihan and avoid taking the attention unto her. And with this, they knew Mark's current state. Unfortunately, there was nothing much they could do to help. They were also struggling to fight dangers around their home. With Dewata Araya also in a weakened state, every ounce of magical energy would be important to them. That's enough about us. Mark spoke to change the topic. What happened to you all here? Although Mark asked them all, his attention was focused on Dewata Araya. Like Mark, Dewata Araya was not in the best state either. In fact, she was way far more weakened compared to Mark. Even though Mark's miasma right now was minuscule, he had other abilities he could use. As for Dewata Araya, she was probably limited to only controlling plants at this moment. Just what happened for a lower deity like Dewata Araya to be reduced in this state? Furthermore, why was the sanctuary not hidden anymore? The secret realms of Mount Madia as in Mount Canlone were still intact even though breaches through the barrier happen every now and then. Then why was the sanctuary like this? Did the barrier and subspace of the sanctuary break for some reason? And Mark's question made the leaders of this place feel troubled and uneasy. Dewata Araya stared at Mark and spoke. You honestly shared your story. I have no choice but to respond to it. And there, Dewata Araya began recalling the problems they faced the moment the second wave started.